What's the duration of your employment here, Melody? David Langston reclined into his expensive chair, speaking with an unsettling casualness. 29 years, correct? That represents quite an achievement, I responded, stating 29 years and 362 days precisely. My stomach churned as I observed the manila envelope positioned on his desk surface. Throughout my entire tenure at GRW Manufacturing, I had never received a summons to a director's office during a Friday afternoon. Clearly something was amiss. My name is Melody Reynolds, age 61, and until 5 minutes prior, I held the position of Senior Compliance Officer at a major manufacturing corporation in St. Paul. Nearly 30 years of my career had been devoted to ensuring Grant Wells operations remained within legal boundaries, recording violations, and maintaining firm positions when colleagues sought simple fixes to complicated issues. My pension benefits were scheduled to become fully vested the following Monday. Merely 3 days remained until I reached the milestone that had motivated my entire professional life. David pushed the envelope across his polished desktop. Budget limitations require us to terminate your employment, he stated without making eye contact, effective at once. The office appeared to shift slightly. Budget limitations. Grant Well had recently reported unprecedented quarterly earnings. Here's your separation package, he continued, tapping the envelope with his well-groomed finger. Sign this by tomorrow or receive nothing. Human Resources will accompany you to gather your belongings. Rather than experiencing anger, shock, or the impulse to beg, an unusual tranquility overcame me. This wasn't coincidental. It was deliberately orchestrated to occur before my pension matured. I appreciate the opportunity, I stated calmly while taking the envelope. I chose not to examine its contents. David appeared taken aback by my composure, possibly anticipating tears or objections, but my career had involved analyzing patterns, and this situation was unmistakably clear. I rose, straightened my clothing, and departed while preserving my dignity. Janet from Human Resources lingered uncomfortably while I gathered my belongings. Thomas's photograph, the plant my daughter had gifted me upon starting college 15 years earlier, and my 25-year service award. I collected very little. Most meaningful items couldn't be contained in a cardboard container. I'm deeply sorry, Melody, Janet murmured, nervously glancing toward the security officer waiting to remove me from the premises. This situation is unjust. That's simply how things are, I responded, though internally I recognized otherwise. This wasn't merely inappropriate. It was likely unlawful. During the previous 4 years, I had been carefully recording financial anomalies that had increased since David joined our organization. I had submitted comprehensive memorandums through proper channels, identified questionable patterns, and even presented proof of backdated documents. Everything had been dismissed, concealed, or returned with directions to concentrate on more urgent matters. Walking through the entrance hall one final time, the security guard awkwardly opened the door. Have a pleasant weekend, Mrs. Reynolds, he said, clearly uncomfortable with his participation in this performance. I acknowledged him courteously. I expect I shall. The journey home felt dreamlike. 29 years of commitment concluded with a manila envelope and a cardboard container. April's rainfall drummed against my windshield as I traveled the familiar St. Paul, Minnesota streets, past the cathedral where Thomas and I exchanged vows, beyond the school where our daughter graduated, toward the humble residence I had maintained alone since becoming widowed 12 years ago. I reflected on the sacrifices made for GRW well, the missed performances during early years when I worked late pursuing promotions, family vacations interrupted by compliance emergencies, countless evenings reviewing documentation that others lacked patience to examine. I had devoted my prime years to the company, trusting in the security my pension would eventually deliver. Upon reaching my driveway, I remained seated momentarily, absorbing the impact of recent events. David Langston had been employed for merely 6 months. He arrived with a reputation for operational efficiency, typically meaning cost reduction at any expense. I anticipated we would eventually conflict when I declined to approve compliance on his recent cost reduction initiative, a measure that circumvented multiple regulatory requirements. What I hadn't expected was how swiftly and mercilessly he would act to remove me. Inside, I prepared tea and sat at my kitchen table, finally examining the separation package. The conditions were offensive. 3 months' salary in exchange for surrendering all future claims against the organization. No pension, no continued health care, no recognition of nearly 3 decades of service. Just payment and a legal snare intended to silence me. The paperwork demanded my signature by 5 p.m. the following day. They relied on fear and desperation to compel quick signing without consultation. This wasn't standard procedure. It was a targeted attempt to steal what I had earned. I set the documents aside and went to my home office where I maintained personal records. Behind family photograph albums sat a fireproof security box. My insurance policy. For 4 years, I had been taking home copies of concerning financial documents, maintaining detailed conversation notes, and preserving emails that revealed misconduct patterns. Not because I intended to use them, but because my professional instincts indicated something was wrong. I opened the container and examined its contents. Loan applications containing false information, quarterly reports with manipulated numbers, emails directing staff to backdate quality control certifications. Everything was present. Over 1,000 pages documenting systematic fraud that had intensified under David's leadership. I had reported every concern through appropriate channels, only to be ignored or marginalized. I reached for my phone, scrolling to a contact unused for years. Gregory Santos had previously served as Grant Wells' chief financial officer before joining the Securities and Exchange Commission. He had always valued my thoroughness, even when others found it bothersome. It's time, I thought as my finger paused over his name. The following morning I awoke with determination. After nearly 2 hours of conversation with Gregory the previous evening, I had a clear plan. I dressed carefully in the navy suit reserved for significant meetings, as if preparing for combat. In many ways I was. Gregory had listened attentively as I described the situation and the documentation I had gathered. His response was measured yet determined. This isn't merely wrongful termination, Melody. Based on your description, Grant Well could face serious securities violations. The timing with your pension, that's only the beginning. He had explained the whistleblower protections available through the SEC and scheduled me to meet with his team Monday morning. Warning: don't sign anything, he had cautioned, and secure those documents safely. Saturday morning was spent duplicating everything, organizing evidence chronologically, and preparing a comprehensive index. The work maintained my focus, preventing anger and hurt from overwhelming me. By noon, 3 identical packages were ready. 1 for the SEC, 1 for my records, and 1 for leverage if necessary. My phone rang repeatedly throughout the day. Janet from HR, David Langston, even the company's general counsel. I allowed each call to reach voicemail, listening to increasingly urgent messages. Melody, we need that paperwork signed today. David's voice was strained. I can collect it personally if that would help. The legal counsel was more direct. Miss Reynolds, receiving your signed agreement before business close is imperative. Failure to comply could jeopardize your entire severance package. Their desperation confirmed my suspicions. They recognized their vulnerability and wanted my silence secured before the weekend concluded. At 4:30 p.m. my doorbell chimed. Through the peephole, I observed David standing on my porch, his expensive suit appearing out of place in my modest neighborhood. I didn't respond. Melody, I know you're inside, he called through the door. This is absurd. Just sign the documents and we can all proceed. I watched silently as he eventually placed an envelope in my mailbox and returned to his luxury vehicle. Only then did I retrieve it. Another copy of the same agreement with a handwritten note. Final opportunity, sign by 9 a.m. Monday. That evening my daughter called for our weekly conversation. Elizabeth was troubled by the unusual tone in my voice. Mom, what's happening? You sound different. I considered minimizing the situation but decided against it. Elizabeth deserved honesty. I was terminated yesterday, I stated simply. What? But you're days away from full pension eligibility. They cannot do that. They did, I replied, but don't worry. I'm addressing it. Do you need me to come home? I can catch a flight from Denver tomorrow. No, sweetheart, remain there. I have this handled. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness approached, thinking about Monday's SEC meeting. For years, I had attempted to address these issues internally, believing in the system and the company's integrity. I had been loyal, discreet, and professional, even when suspecting serious wrongdoing. But Grantwell had made its choice, and now I would make mine. I would not sign their agreement. I would not be silenced. Most importantly, I would not allow them to discard 3 decades of my life without consequences. Monday couldn't arrive soon enough. Monday morning came with clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I dressed carefully, placed my documentation in a secure briefcase, and drove downtown to the federal building where Gregory had arranged our meeting. The weight of my impending actions pressed heavily on my shoulders, but there was also a sense of correctness to it all. The SEC offices were understated yet imposing glass partitions and hushed conversations throughout. Gregory met me in the lobby, his familiar face bearing more years but still carrying the sharp intelligence I remembered. "Melody," he said warmly, grasping my hand. "I wish our meeting occurred under better circumstances." "It's wonderful to see you, Gregory," I replied. "Thank you for treating this seriously." He escorted me to a conference room where 2 additional investigators waited, Angela Brennan, a senior enforcement attorney, and James Weston, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Reynolds," Angela began, "before we proceed, I want to confirm you understand today's process. Once you share this information with us, an official investigation begins. There's no reversing course." He nodded. "I understand completely." For the following 3 hours, I guided them through my documentation. The irregular financial reporting I had first noticed 4 years ago when shipments didn't match invoices, the quality control certifications backdated after products had already shipped, the revenue manipulation pattern that had intensified in recent quarters, particularly following David Langston's arrival. James examined the financial documents with increasing concern. "These discrepancies aren't minor," he observed. "The company has been systematically overstating revenues by at least 18% for the past 2 years. That constitutes securities fraud." "And you reported these issues internally?" Angela asked. "Multiple times," I confirmed, showing them copies of my memorandums and emails. Each time I was told the issues were being handled or that I was misinterpreting the information. When David joined 6 months ago, my concerns began being redirected to his office where they vanished entirely. Gregory leaned forward. "And you believe your termination was directly connected to these reports?" "Without question," I replied. "The timing, 3 days before my pension vested, makes it obvious. But beyond that, I had recently flagged several major issues with David's latest cost-cutting initiative. He needed me eliminated before I could escalate further." As our meeting concluded, Angela outlined the next steps. "We'll need your formal statement, then we'll commence our investigation, which typically remains confidential until we determine whether enforcement action is warranted." "How long will that require?" I asked. "It varies," she replied, "but given the documentation you've provided and the clear misconduct pattern, we may proceed quickly on this matter." I hadn't even returned home when my phone rang. It was Janet from HR, her voice trembling. "Melody, something's occurring. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's been confined to his office all morning, and there are rumors about SEC investigators contacting our general counsel." So it had commenced faster than I'd anticipated. The SEC must have immediately contacted Grantwell's legal team. "I'm not surprised," I said calmly. "Did you?" Janet hesitated. "Melody, did you report something?" "I simply did what I should have done years ago," I replied. "What's happening with my pension paperwork?" "That's why I'm calling. The executive committee is reviewing your termination. They've suspended everything until further notice." An hour later my phone rang again. This time it was William Hargrove, the board chairman, a man who had barely acknowledged my existence during our few previous interactions. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his typically confident voice sounding strained. "We seem to have a situation requiring your input. Would you be willing to come to the office tomorrow morning to discuss matters?" "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Hargrove," I replied. "Any discussions should include my attorney and potentially Securities and Exchange Commission representatives. I'm sure you understand." The silence on the other end was profound. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I see. Perhaps we can arrange something more formal then." As I hung up, I felt no satisfaction. Only deep weariness at the necessity of it all. I had never wanted to be a whistleblower. I had only wanted to perform my job with integrity and retire with the security I'd earned. But J.R.W. Well had forced my hand, and now we would all face the consequences. My phone continued ringing throughout the evening, colleagues seeking information, executives attempting damage control. I answered none of them. The time for private conversations had ended. Now everything would happen in the light. By Wednesday morning, the storm had fully erupted. Local business publications ran headlines about an SEC investigation into Grant Well Manufacturing, sending the company's stock into a tailspin. Financial analysts who had praised David's efficiency measures just weeks earlier now questioned the integrity of the company's entire reporting structure. I received a formal letter from Grant Well's legal department withdrawing my termination notice and placing me on administrative leave with full benefits pending an internal review. It was a transparent attempt to mitigate damages, arriving far too late. At 10 a.m., my attorney Barbara Reynolds, no relation, but the coincidence amused us both, accompanied me to a meeting at Grant Well's headquarters. The same security guard who had escorted me out on Friday now nodded respectfully as we entered. The atmosphere in the building was tense, with employees huddled in whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when we passed. We were shown to the main boardroom where William Hargrove waited with the company's outside counsel and 3 other board members. David Langston was conspicuously absent. "Thank you for coming, Miss Reynolds," William began, seeming to have aged years in just a few days. "We've initiated a comprehensive internal investigation into the concerns you've raised." Barbara spoke before I could respond. "Let's be clear about something, Mr. Hargrove. Ms. Reynolds didn't suddenly raise these concerns after her termination. She documented and reported them repeatedly over a 4-year period, as her job required her to do. The company's decision to ignore those reports and then terminate her days before her pension vested speaks volumes." William shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, that's part of what we're investigating. I want to personally assure Miss Reynolds that her termination has been rescinded. We consider her an employee in good standing with all benefits intact, including my pension." Asked directly. "Of course," he replied quickly. "In fact, we're prepared to offer you a consulting role after your retirement, which you can begin immediately if you wish. We value your expertise." "And my client isn't making any decisions today," Barbara interrupted. "And any discussion about future arrangements should be preceded by a full accounting of how her previous concerns were suppressed." The meeting continued for another hour with the board members attempting to distance themselves from both David's actions and the financial irregularities I documented. They painted themselves as victims of misinformation, expressing shock and disappointment at the apparent misconduct. I remained mostly silent, letting Barbara handle the legal maneuvering while I observed their body language. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, yet they'd never noticed me. Not really. Now they couldn't look away, their expressions a mix of fear and newfound respect. As we prepared to leave, William made one final appeal. "Melody, we're hoping you might consider speaking with the SEC investigators about the corrective actions we're taking. Your support would be invaluable." I looked at him directly for the first time. "Mr. Hargrove, I've spent 29 years dedicated to this company's compliance. During that time, I filed 47 major reports documenting serious irregularities. I sent 16 memos specifically addressing the issues now under investigation. I requested 9 meetings with executive leadership to discuss these concerns, of which only 2 were granted, and neither resulted in action. At what point in that history did I have your support?" The room fell silent. I'll cooperate fully with both the internal investigation and the SEC, I continued. But I'll be speaking only to the facts, as I always have. Whether those facts support or damage Grant Well will depend entirely on what you do next, not what you say in this room. As Barbara and I walked out, she whispered, "That was perfectly stated." It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I allowed myself a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to fade, leaving me drained but clear-headed. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was merely the beginning of accountability. "What happens now?" I asked Barbara as we stood beside our cars. "Now," she smiled slightly. "Now they scramble to save what they can while the investigation continues. But make no mistake, Melody. They're terrified of you." I shook my head. "They're not terrified of me. They're terrified of the truth. There's a difference." Barbara nodded thoughtfully. "There is indeed, and that difference is why you'll win this, regardless of how it plays out." As I drove home, I wondered what Thomas would have thought of all this. My late husband had always encouraged my meticulous nature, even when others found it frustrating. "Your attention to detail isn't a quirk, Melody," he'd say. "It's a superpower." Perhaps he'd been right all along. By Friday, exactly 1 week after my termination, the story had evolved into a full-blown corporate scandal. The SEC had issued formal requests for information from Grant Well, and an internal memo from William Hargrove announced David Langston's immediate suspension pending investigation. The company's stock had dropped nearly 30%, triggering concerns from major investors and partners. I was no longer just Melody Reynolds, overlooked compliance officer. Business journals now referred to me as a whistleblower and the woman who exposed Grant Well. The sudden attention was uncomfortable, but I remained focused on the process, working closely with the SEC investigators who now had offices set up in a separate building near Grant's headquarters. The evidence I'd provided had opened many doors, but the investigation was revealing even more troubling patterns. Gregory called to update me on their progress. "Melody, it's worse than we thought," he said, his voice grave. "The financial manipulation goes back at least 5 years, predating Langston. He accelerated it, but he didn't start it." "I suspected as much," I replied. "There were irregularities I couldn't fully document because I couldn't access certain executive-level reports." "Well, we can access them now," Gregory continued, "and they tell a story of systematic fraud designed to inflate the company's value. The board is claiming ignorance, but at least 3 members had to have known. They signed off on key transactions. This news should have vindicated me, but instead it left me feeling hollow. The company I dedicated my life to had been corrupted at levels even I hadn't fully comprehended. The people I trusted with my concerns had been actively participating in the very fraud I was reporting. That afternoon, I received a call from Elizabeth. Her voice was tight with anger. "Mom, have you seen the news? They're trying to discredit you." I hadn't. I'd been avoiding media coverage, focusing instead on the official proceedings. "What are they saying?" I asked calmly. "That GRW executive Langston gave an interview claiming you had performance issues and were bitter about being passed over for promotion. He's making it sound like you're retaliating because of personal grievances." I wasn't surprised. It was a predictable defense strategy. Attack the whistleblower's credibility rather than address the allegations. "It doesn't matter, Elizabeth," I assured her. "The evidence speaks for itself. My performance reviews have been exemplary for 29 years. They can't rewrite that history now." But David was trying to do exactly that. By that evening, several news outlets had picked up his narrative, questioning my motives and suggesting I had manipulated documentation to frame him. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but it still stung to see my integrity questioned so publicly. Barbara called immediately. "Don't respond to any of it," she advised. "The SEC will issue a statement tomorrow clarifying your whistleblower status and the credibility of your evidence. Let the official channels handle this." I wasn't planning to respond, I told her, but I am going to do something else. The next morning I drove to my local bank and asked to speak with the manager. Tracy Ferguson. I'd known her for years as she handled most of Grant Well's local banking transactions. Melody, she greeted me warmly. I've been following the news. How are you holding up? I'm fine, Tracy, but I need access to my safe deposit box. Inside the private room, I opened the box and removed a sealed envelope I'd placed there 3 years ago. It contained copies of email exchanges between David's predecessor and 2 board members discussing ways to manage financial appearances during a critical acquisition period. I had found these accidentally while archiving old emails, and something had told me to secure them separately from my other documentation. I hadn't included these in my initial SEC report because they weren't directly related to the current issues, but now, with David attempting to undermine my credibility, they provided crucial context showing that the problematic practices predated my concerns about him specifically. I called Gregory immediately. I have something you need to see, I told him. Changes the narrative completely. As I drove to meet him, I felt no satisfaction. Only certainty that the full truth would now emerge, regardless of who was implicated. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday morning, 10 days after my termination and 7 days after the SEC investigation became public. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. The additional documentation I'd provided had accelerated the investigation dramatically, implicating not just David but multiple board members in a years-long pattern of financial manipulation. Gregory called me from outside the meeting room. It's chaos in there, he reported. The SEC enforcement team just presented their preliminary findings. 3 board members have resigned on the spot. David is trying to claim he was following established practices, but no one's buying it anymore. By noon, Grant Well issued a press release announcing a leadership restructuring and full cooperation with regulatory authorities. The carefully worded statement confirmed the resignation of 4 board members, including William Hargrove, and the termination of David Langston for cause. The company's stock, already battered, dropped another 12%. That afternoon my phone rang. It was Janet from HR again. The interim CEO wants to meet with you tomorrow if possible. The interim CEO was Patricia Donovan, the former chief operating officer who had always treated me with professional respect, if not warmth. I agreed to the meeting but insisted it take place at my attorney's office. When Patricia arrived the next day, she looked exhausted but determined. Melody, I won't waste time with pleasantries, she began. The company is in crisis, and you're at the center of it, not because you did anything wrong but because you were the only one who consistently did what was right. She slid a folder across the table, eerily similar to the termination paperwork David had presented just 11 days earlier. This officially rescinds your termination, reinstates your employment retroactively, and confirms your full pension vesting, she explained. It also includes an additional compensation package recognizing the difficulties you've experienced. I opened the folder. The compensation package included a sum equal to 5 years of my salary, full healthcare coverage for life, and a formal apology from the board. We're also establishing a new corporate ethics division, Patricia continued. We'd like you to help design it as a consultant after your retirement. Your experience is invaluable. I closed the folder without commenting on the offer. And David Langston. The board members involved. Patricia's expression hardened. Criminal charges are expected. The company will not be defending them. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Grant Well Manufacturing. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching as David Langston and 2 former board members entered guilty pleas to securities fraud charges. The man who had so casually ended my career now looked diminished in his dark suit. His arrogance replaced by defeat. Our eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and I saw recognition there. Not of me specifically, but of what I represented, the consequences of his actions personified. The GRW scandal had become a case study in corporate governance failures and the crucial role of internal compliance. I had declined the consulting position with a reorganized company, choosing instead to work with regulatory agencies to develop better whistleblower protocols. My story had inspired other compliance officers to come forward with their own documentation of corporate wrongdoing, creating a ripple effect across industries. The SEC had awarded me a substantial whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against Grant Well. Combined with my pension and the settlement, I had more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible. I'd established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance, naming it after Thomas. Elizabeth had relocated to St. Paul to be closer to me, bringing my 2 grandchildren with her. We spent weekends together at my new lakeside home, building memories I'd missed while working all those long hours. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the water, Elizabeth asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret staying at GRW Well all those years, given how it ended?" I considered this carefully. "No," I finally answered. "I regret that it was necessary to expose them, but I don't regret my work there. Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about maintaining your principles even when, especially when, it costs you something." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "You taught me that, not with words but by example." That, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all. Not the vindication, not the financial security, but the knowledge that my choices had shown my daughter what it meant to stand firm in your values regardless of the consequences. As for GRW Well Manufacturing, the company had survived, though greatly diminished. The new leadership had implemented stringent compliance protocols and transparent reporting practices. They still sent me their annual reports. Perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as an apology. I read them carefully, noting the improved practices with professional satisfaction. Some might see my story as one of revenge, but I've never viewed it that way. I simply did what I had always done. Documented the facts, reported the truth, and stood by my findings. The difference is that this time, finally, others were forced to listen.